on the Big 550 KTRS.
Well, who knew yawning was so interesting? Maria Konnikova is a New Yorker columnist. Maria, thanks for joining us here in St. Louis.
Thanks for having me.
Your story about the surprising science behind why and when we yawn has gotten a lot of attention. I thought we just yawned because we needed oxygen.
You know, that's what a lot of people thought, and that's one of the first theories that Robert Provine, who has been studying yawning for over 3 decades, investigated in the early 80s, and he found out that that's just simply not true. So if we yawned because we needed oxygen, then when you're at the gym, you'd be yawning all the time because your body would be needing oxygen. That doesn't happen, does it?
This guy's been studying yawning for 30-plus years?
Yep, that's exactly right. He's been studying what he calls curious behaviors. So those types of behaviors that we really take for granted and don't know much about, like yawning, like laughing, like hiccuping, those types of things. Yes.
Okay, the contagious yawn. Mm-hmm. Why do we do that? Why do we yawn after we see someone else yawn?
That's a really interesting question, especially because we share yawning, just regular yawning, spontaneous yawning, with all vertebrates. But contagious yawning is something that so far we know for sure only humans and chimpanzees have. And what this means is when you see someone yawn, especially if it's someone you feel close to, so if it's a family member, if it's a loved one, if it's a close friend, you're going to catch, so to speak, that yawn and yawn as well. And so what we think is happening is that this is some sort of social signal. So I'm signaling to you what's going on inside me. You know, I might be tired, I might be bored, I might be anxious, I might be hungry. All of these things might be going on. And when I yawn, I tell you, hey, something's going on, and you yawn back to say, oh, I hear you. I'm understanding what's happening.
Did he do anything with dogs? Because I've heard when you yawn with your dog or your dog yawns with you, you're sort of bonding with your dog.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There have been a few studies that have looked at contagious yawning in dogs, and unfortunately the evidence really is inconclusive. So we know that dogs yawn, but we know that, like I said, all vertebrates yawn. As far as contagious yawning, we simply don't know. It's very easy to want your dog to be empathetic and to want to think that you and your dog are connecting. So we tend to really put human states into dogs' minds, but the evidence for that simply isn't there yet. Maybe it will be.
Yeah, in your story in The New Yorker, and you can find it online at thenewyorker.com, you say that we cannot voluntarily yawn.
That's absolutely right. So if I tell you, hey, yawn right now, you're not going to be able to do it. You might be able to mimic yawning, but it's not going to be an actual yawn. It's not going to bring you the satisfaction of yawning, because yawning feels good if you think about it. When you yawn, when you have a nice full yawn, that's not a bad feeling.
I think it feels better when you're like making the noise also when
yes,
yawning, not a silent yawn.
Absolutely. Well, there's nothing worse than trying to stifle a yawn when you yawn and you shouldn't be. An interrupted yawn is really, really frustrating.
What's the story of the paralyzed people who yawn all of a sudden gain control of their limbs?
Yes, this was a fascinating story that I found from the 1920s. There was a neurologist, a British neurologist, whose name was Sir Francis Walsh, and he didn't study yawning. He studied reflexes, and he specifically worked with patients who were paralyzed on one side of their body. They're called hemiplegics because they have control over one side but no control over the other. And he was trying to study their reflexes, and he noticed something that was really, really interesting, which is when they yawned, they suddenly could move the limbs on the side of their body that had been paralyzed. And the patients knew this as well. Some of them took advantage of these yawns to exercise the fingers of their hands, the toes of their feet, things that they couldn't otherwise move. And so Walsh realized that yawning was really activating some very primal center of the brain, something that was, before conscious control. So you could have cortical control that was completely missing, and yet you have this intact brainstem system that makes you able to access your motion when it's being activated. And I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Okay, now, so you've basically changed everything we know about yawning. Do we yawn when we're bored, at least?
We do yawn when we're bored.
Okay, good.
Yes, that's absolutely right. But you also yawn when you're anxious. One of the interesting things that I discovered in researching this piece is that members of the military who have to train to jump out of planes, before their first jump, they often start yawning a lot because they're really nervous.
That's interesting. What about age? Does age have anything to do with yawning?
Yes, age does seem to have something to do with yawning. So there's a sort of inverse U curve. So we start yawning in the womb. So babies who are as young as the first trimester are already yawning in utero. But we don't develop contagious yawning until we're about 5 or 6. And then we start yawning more and more as we get older. And then at some point, when you reach this tipping point of age, you start yawning less. So older people are less susceptible. So when you're in your 60s, when you're in your 70s, you're less susceptible to contagious yawning than you were when you're in your 30s or your 40s. So it's a really interesting inverse relationship.
Maria, it sounds like you know everything there is to know about yawning. How did you get interested in this? How did you find this story?
Well, honestly, it came from personal experience, just because I yawn, and I wondered, well, why am I actually yawning? Is it because I need oxygen to my brain? Is it because my body's trying to wake up? And so I figured that if it's something that interested me, then it probably was a question that a lot of people asked. So I started digging deeper and found that there was a lot of really interesting material here.
What's been the reaction of your story in the New Yorker?
It's been really positive. I think that people didn't really realize that yawning could be such a complicated question. And it's really interesting that we started with this oxygen theory. It seems to be one of the most prevalent folk theories of yawning. So I've had people, come back to me and say, well, isn't it because of oxygen? And I have to say over and over, no, actually it isn't.
Wow.
All right, NewYorker.com, Maria Konnikova, New Yorker columnist, the unbelievable story, the surprising science behind why and when we yawn. Maria, thank you for joining in. Great story, and have a good day.
You too. Thank you so much.
You got it. 728 here, Big 550 KTRS. I thought it was because John Carney was on the radio.
Stop
it turns out it's not. See, it's a different reason.